Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final webinar on character and moral education, the third element of what we call prosocial human development. In some ways, this is a much more complicated topic than either SEL or mindfulness. It requires us to get a bit more philosophical and perhaps less practical than the other two. But to me, this is the area that I find most exciting and fascinating because it forces us to think more deeply about life and about who we are. So here we go. These are our topics for this webinar. To start, we're going to look at character and moral education around the world, and then some different definitions of character education. We'll also look at different ways people teach character, some of the research on the impact of character education, current offerings for schools and higher education, and we'll finish with challenges and current trends. Then, to wrap up the three webinars, we'll consider how SEL, mindfulness, and character education are actually complementary, and how, when they're used together, will offer a more complete system for healthy development. We'll also look at some very practical examples of what it might look like when all three are put into action. One note I want to make is I use the terms character and moral education interchangeably throughout the webinar. Here in the United States and academia, these are considered separate fields, but for the sake of ease, I'm going to weave the topics and the terms together. So I want to start by pointing out that most of the research on character and moral education has, like SEL and mindfulness, been seen through a white American lens, which in this case often means ancient Greek and Protestant. While this research has taught us a lot about moral development and has also taught us how much we don't know, when you look at the moral ideology and education from other countries and cultures around the world, it becomes obvious at how narrow a lens this actually is. So for an example, in China, moral education is grounded in Confucianism, with Ren or benevolence being the main outcome for moral development. In other words, love for all, for one's family, for others, for country. And then filial piety, or respect for one's parents and ancestors, is the foundation of cultivating Ren. In India, moral education in the Hindu culture and religion is shaped by the ancient Vedic system of education that says the purpose of life is moksha, or liberation from the repeated cycle of birth and death, and that morality is just one step towards achieving moksha. Morality was taught in the ancient Vedic system mainly through the teacher-student relationship, so hence the importance of the teacher's own moral and spiritual life. Because of this history, educators in India today actually have a difficult time seeing the difference between moral and spiritual education, and this presents a huge challenge in a pluralistic country whose cultural, linguistic, and religious diversity actually dwarfs that of the United States. In Islam, too, morality and religion go hand in hand with the Quran and the Hadith, which is a collection of sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. So the Quran and the Hadith provide a list of rules, duties, and responsibilities. And to quote one Islamic scholar, one of the main differences between an Islamic approach to morality and a Western approach is how we define the good and who we actually are. This idea of personal and moral autonomy doesn't quite fit, according to one Islamic scholar, with how Islam approaches morality, because it usurps God's position of the judge of good and evil, and it also cuts off the individual from society, which has a duty to publicly uphold moral behavior and religious practice. So then in sub-Saharan Africa, morality centers on Ubuntu, the idea that I am because we are, which means we are dependent on each other, but also acknowledging the interdependence of all beings in the universe. One's ultimate goal should be to become a full person, and the only way to develop one's humanness is to relate to others in a positive way. Positive relationships are defined in communal terms, so to seek out community and to live in harmony with them. To give a couple of examples as to how this plays out in life in comparison to the West. So regarding property, in the West, we own property as individuals because this respects our autonomy and also produces wealth. With Ubuntu, property is distributed in a way that expresses esteem for communal relationships. So membership in the community means that you might be given a portion of this land to put to good use. Another example is criminal justice. In the West, we punish offenders by putting them into prison, with the idea that the fear of this would keep the offender from offending again, and as an example to other possible offenders. With Ubuntu, reconciliation is the aim of criminal justice. The idea is to resolve conflict between the offender and his victims, or between his family and the families who are offended. So it's more of a restorative justice approach. So this quick trip around the world, which left out many, many cultures and countries, was extremely brief and very limited in its descriptions. And I apologize if I made any mistakes or pronounced anything wrong. And if you have corrections to make, please do so at the Summer Institute. But I wanted to give an idea of how differently people approach morality and to keep this in mind as we dive more deeply into moral education in the United States. So, looking at these different approaches to moral education, it becomes evident that this field requires us to ask ourselves some very fundamental questions. So, for example, what does it mean to be a good moral human being? Who decides what values are important? How does morality contribute to our view of the other? What is the actual purpose of character and moral education? Is it necessary for religion and moral education to intersect? And can moral education be taught apart from religion? And if so, how? And then these questions ask us to ask even more broad questions, such as what is the purpose of education? And then what is the purpose of life? And then finally, what is the source for the answers to these questions? And then once we've answered all these questions, or not, we have to ask the most basic question of all that has really confounded people from all over the world for ages. How do we educate for good character, especially in a pluralistic society and a pluralistic world? I invite you to pause and take a moment to ponder these questions if you like. So what is the answer to this question? How do we educate for good character in a pluralistic world? How do we get people to know the good and actually do the good? And to be honest, in academia, there is very little agreement. There is no one answer. To quote one of the leaders in the field of character education, Marvin Berkowitz, he said, "This is rocket science," and it really is. There just is no silver bullet. But that doesn't mean we don't keep trying to figure it out. I don't think anyone would disagree that our world is in a state of crisis. We're really trying to tackle the basics of how do we all get along with each other. So the work that practitioners and academics in this field are doing has become that much more urgent and necessary. Now, I want to give just a brief overview of the history of moral education in the United States. Again, this history starts with white European immigrants to the U.S. Unfortunately, this history does not take into consideration the moral ideology of people here in the U.S. who are not from dominant culture, and in particular, the moral ideology of the indigenous peoples. This is a glaring omission in the research and the history, and here and there, small attempts are being made to rectify this, but much, much more needs to be done. So the research on the history of moral education in the United States starts with the original colonizers on the East Coast, most of whom were white and Protestant. Moral development was central to the raising of the children and was seen as the responsibility of the families and eventually of the mothers. But by the 1830s, more and more people were sending their children to public schools, which were open to all white children on a mostly equal basis. The leadership for these schools came from the white Protestant upper and middle classes because they feared the instability that could happen in a democracy that was becoming increasingly diverse with a rapidly growing immigrant population. To quote educational historian B. Edward McClellan, he wrote, "They saw the widespread diffusion of moral education to all groups in the society as a way to preserve harmony and order. They often feared and distrusted the families of the poor and the immigrants, not to mention Blacks and Native Americans, and they hoped to use the public school, even where it was racially segregated, as an institution for remedial moral instruction. What was critical was that all children learn self-restraint through a common moral code." So with the continued social upheaval of the old order that was caused by ongoing immigration, urbanization, and mobility, meaning Americans' tendency to move away from their families, along with the seemingly separate sectors of society, such as family, schools, religious institutions, work, all of which supposedly demand different values, this argument for whose morals and how has continued to this day. If you want to know more about this fascinating history, I really recommend McClellan's book that's listed there on the slide. So where does that leave us today? In a nutshell, the researchers narrow the challenge of moral and character education into three areas. The first is definition of character. Then what is the source of morals? Whose morals are we teaching? And finally, how do we teach it? I want to just briefly mention here that when you look at the small body of research on other cultures' approaches to moral education, you often find that they are struggling with these same issues, particularly with how to teach it in this globalized world. So I'm going to cover each of these topics briefly. Starting with the definition of character. Very simply, there is no agreement among the researchers of what the definition of character actually is. However, the definitions have evolved from the ancient Greeks, namely Plato and Aristotle. So According to Wren, 2014, Western moral understanding is rooted in these ancient Greeks. In very simple terms, Plato believed that a person who knows what is good will therefore do it. No one would willingly act immorally, and if they did, it was only because they didn't have the knowledge of what is good. Aristotle, on the other hand, believed that a person becomes good by learning first what it is to do good. A person may be able to think about what is good without having the disposition to do good. So how do you go from knowing the good to actually doing the good? And as I mentioned, we are still struggling with this today. So we can see hints of the Greeks in the sampling of modern definitions. So for example, Wynne and Ryan defined character as good traits that are on regular display. Berkowitz and his colleagues define character as the set of psychological characteristics that motivate and enable one to function as a moral agent, to perform optimally, to effectively pursue knowledge and intellectual flourishing, and to be an effective member of society. And then finally, Narvaez and Lapsley write, one's character is an indelible mark of consistency and predictability. It denotes enduring dispositional tendencies in behavior. It points to something deeply rooted in personality, to its organizing principle that integrates behavior, attitudes, and values. So just in these three definitions, you can see how our understanding of character is evolving. The first assumes both knowing and doing the good, whereas the next two start to acknowledge the complexity of character, including how character is related to our psychological makeup. But again, what these definitions point out is that no one really agrees on what character is or where the motivation to act morally comes from. Another area of uncertainty is the source of morals, or whose morals do we teach? This is particularly critical in pluralistic societies where people come from many different cultures and religions. So is the source of morality religious or secular or both? And if it's religious, then whose religion? One attempt at making a list of universal virtues came from two of the founders of the positive psychology movement, Martin Seligman and Chris Peterson. They combed through ancient spiritual and wisdom traditions and the work of great philosophers to see if there actually was a coherent set of virtues that might emerge. And they found that there were 6 core virtues: courage, justice, humanity, temperance, wisdom, and transcendence. They found that these broad categories then could be broken down into lists of discrete virtues. So the table on this slide shows the 24 virtues, which they call character strengths. And there's been a bit of research that's been done on these character strengths, and they have been associated with a range of positive outcomes for teens, including increased mental health and well-being, and lower substance use, alcohol abuse, smoking, and violence. So the question of source is often seen as a traditional versus progressive point of view as well. In the traditional approach, the emphasis is on a list of virtues to be taught, such as honesty, caring, fairness, responsibility, respect, etc. The purpose of moral education is usually private virtue and personal conduct. In the progressive approach, there is no list of values to be taught. Instead, the emphasis is on the ability to make moral judgments and developing an ethical sensitivity to the demands of a changing society. The purpose is more civic and political rather than personal. So the traditional versus progressive approach can also be seen in how character education is taught. The traditional approach relies on direct methods of instruction. So for example, specific virtues are identified, taught about in a didactic way, often through the use of stories. The progressive approach emphasizes the construction of moral meaning through democratic processes, cooperative learning, and moral discussion. Lapsley and Narvaez talk about how in the traditional approach, morality is ready-made and good character requires submission to pre-existing norms. And traditionalists are actually suspicious of progressives, they say, because the progressives' approach seemingly allows the adults to abdicate their role as moral teachers in favor of consensual democratic practices in schools. To them, it speaks of moral relativism, letting the kids decide which morals they want to adhere to, assuming that they will always choose well. So in general, the character education field has relied more on direct rather than indirect approaches, and the moral education field relies more on the indirect approach. And summing up the traditional versus progressive approach to character education, researchers have put it very simply. Traditionalists have the content, but not the pedagogical methods, and progressives have the pedagogical methods, but not the content. And there's finally some consensus in the field that both content and pedagogical methods are necessary. But as we'll see in a minute, the current trend is to go even deeper than content and pedagogy. I also want to briefly mention that some researchers point out the hidden curriculum that teaches morality, which no school can really avoid. And here's a little cartoon, Peanuts cartoon, that sort of gives an example of hidden curriculum. So a basic definition of hidden curriculum comes in part from Philip Jackson, the researcher who coined the term in 1968. The hidden curriculum is very generally the unstated norms, values, and beliefs that are transmitted to students through crowds, praise, and power. Now, I do want to mention that there's been a lot of research since Jackson first coined the term in 1968 on hidden curriculum that has really expanded the definition, but that could be a whole webinar in itself. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview of how Jackson saw it. So with crowds, students have to learn to live in crowds in school. They have to wait or suffer in silence to use resources, or they'll have to give up desires. They learn to be quiet, and they learn patience. Then through praise, they learn what is valued, how to evaluate oneself and also others. And then finally, power comes down to teachers versus students, really, with students being, quote unquote, pawns of institutional authorities. Some researchers suggest that the hidden curriculum is what teaches students to operate in the dominant culture's world, especially once they are in the workplace. So some examples of what this might sound like in the classroom. Please show respect for the person speaking by listening carefully and then responding. Why did the settlers treat the Native Americans that way? It doesn't seem fair. And then higher education, the idea of building social capital with professors to seek out possible opportunities is part of the hidden curriculum as well. My actual favorite example of hidden curriculum comes from a study about the moral life in classrooms that Jackson co-authored. So when a student says something in class that seems controversial, you'll notice the eyes of the students immediately turn on the teacher to see how the teacher responds. Does the teacher ignore or address the comment or something else? And this is a lot of power in the hands of the teacher, whether or not the teacher realizes it, because it's setting up those power dynamics with figures of authority. One particularly fascinating study of the hidden curriculum in a variety of U.S. high schools, such as public, charter, elite, private, religious, progressive, is captured in the recently published book, The Content of Their Character. It's just a book I want to mention. We're going to talk more about this at the Institute. So we've just covered the basics of the philosophical background of Western character and moral education. It's a lot to think about. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I think it's really critical to have this background and understanding as education struggles with how and if to teach morality and character. So now I'm going to briefly review some of the current offerings in the character education field. The first is some character researchers have divided character into 4 categories, into moral character, performance character, civic character, and intellectual character. And examples of each of these can be seen on the slide. So just to give you an example of how this works and what the potential implications are. Looking just at moral character and performance character, you'll see that when you think about it, both are really necessary. So moral character without performance character makes it actually very difficult to be kind and compassionate. You need the inner strength of performance character to be compassionate when faced with a difficult situation. Think of what it takes to stand up in the face of bullying or some other kind of moral transgression. But then when you have just performance character without moral character, it's just downright scary. Without getting too political, I'm sure that many of today's politicians, world leaders, and corporate CEOs have an awful lot of performance character, but they lack the moral character. And so hence part of the reason we're in the mess we are today. But a lot of schools are focusing just on performance character, but they need to round it out with these other aspects of character as well. So Scott Sider from Boston University did a study of 3 schools that focused on cultivating either moral or performance character. And he found that each had different outcomes. The school that focused on moral development showed greater academic integrity, whereas the 2 that focused on performance character demonstrated higher levels of perseverance and community connectedness. This is a new way to look at character, and much more research actually needs to be done to understand it fully. So these are some sample character education curricula and programs for pre-K through higher ed, all of which differ greatly in their approach. The Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues out of the University of Birmingham in the UK has some really interesting K-12 curriculum that blends character with SEL and mindfulness, and all of it is free and online, and I've included the hyperlink there on the slide. They are just starting to do some of the work on the development of the adults as well. Character counts is what would be considered a more traditional approach with a list of values to be directly taught. Character.org plays an umbrella role in the character education field in the United States, really looking at the work of Thomas Lacona, the 11 Principles of Character Education, which really are more of a guide for implementation, and they're seen as a mixture of traditional and progressive approaches. But again, there's some criticism about whose values are we actually teaching. Character Lab grew out of Angela Duckworth's work on grit, and the center is now creating playbooks on developing specific performance character strengths, such as grit, curiosity, self-control. I'm not sure if they're going to actually venture into other areas of character. And then Marvin Berkowitz, who I mentioned earlier as a leader in the character education field, and some of his colleagues have put together a clearinghouse of character education programs, including some programs that are considered SEL programs. And at the higher ed level, again, as you can imagine, it's hard to find actual programs. But Ann Colby, one of the leading researchers on the development of civic character in higher ed, has written a book about moral development for undergraduates that professors can use. So just to provide a very brief example of what traditional character education lessons might look like, here are a few. So maybe creating an acrostic poem using the word kindness, interviewing staff to promote a caring school community, or maybe a service learning activity. So research on impact, this is where it gets challenging. The research on character education is not great, especially when compared to the SEL field with its requirement for randomized controlled trials, particularly speaking of CASTLE and its list of programs. There is some push and pull between the SEL and character education field, with some experts in each claiming to be the umbrella term for the other. So sometimes you'll see character researchers saying that character education programs do work, but oftentimes they're referring to SEL programs. Other character education researchers have called for less strict requirements, such as not having to do a randomized controlled trial to be seen as valid, especially given the complex nature of character development. In any case, measuring impact has been one of the main weaknesses of the character education field. So, where do character and moral education go from here? First is character psychology. So researchers are starting to use our understanding of biological, neurological, emotional, motivational, and other systems to go deeper into the whys and hows of moral development. So for example, looking at aspects such as how do we actually develop a conscience? Or how our attachment style, meaning our working model of relationships that develop through our relationship with our caregivers when we were young, how this might affect our moral development, or how the strength of our moral identity may determine our willingness to act morally. One of the most interesting new fields of research is called moral disengagement, or why people choose to not act morally when they actually know what the moral thing to do is. We're going to look more closely at many of these areas at the Institute. Another new trend is the science of purpose, which translates to meaningful long-term goals that allow one to contribute to the broader world. Some researchers are suggesting that a sense of purpose may serve as a motivational tool for moral action. And again, we'll cover more of this at the Institute. And then there's always the ongoing debate over whose values, whose virtues, whose ethics. I don't think this debate's going to end anytime soon. And then Scott Sider, who I mentioned earlier, is doing some very interesting research around the development of critical consciousness and character. The term critical consciousness comes from Paulo Freire's work, and in a nutshell, it's the ability to engage in reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. Sider has looked at developing critical consciousness with students of color in progressive and no excuses urban high schools. He's also researched privileged groups of students with some interesting outcomes. So in one study, he found that mainly white privileged high school students here in the United States who took a class on social justice actually decreased in their support for educational equity between wealthy and poor communities because of the fear that they may one day become poor or homeless. And then another study he did of mainly white privileged high school students who had taken a course on social justice and literature found that while students may have increased their knowledge of situational factors such as low wages, job shortages, racism, lack of affordable housing, poor educational opportunities, et cetera, that can contribute to poverty and homelessness. Overall, the students continue to justify that the existing opportunity structure in the United States is legitimate and inevitable. So my only comment is we still have a lot of work to do. So finally, another trend is the integration of SEL character education and mindfulness. And this is what we're attempting to do at the GGSC, and also other groups are as well. And I'll talk more about this in a moment. So that completes the overview of character education. And now I just want to talk briefly about what the integration of SEL, mindfulness, and character education means. So how do these all fit together? But first, I want to show you a model that the GGSC education program created to illustrate our view of education. So if you look at this model, if the educational process is a tree, then SEL, mindfulness, and character education, and a few other constructs form the roots of the educational process. We believe that education has to be grounded in human development and hopefully prosocial human development. So the roots form the trunk, which is the well-being of the student and a pro-social mindset, meaning education is not just about the development of the individual, but also about the individual's capacity and motivation to contribute to the greater good of the world. So then we get into the actual academic content. The branches are the subject areas such as science, language arts, math. Twigs are the individual topics in the subjects such as chemistry and physics. And finally, the leaves are the individual lessons. So traditionally, education has focused an awful lot on the lessons. And what we're advocating for is we need to grow those roots of the tree in order for the rest to happen. So again, feel free to push pause if you'd like to take a closer look at this model. So next, this science of prosocial human development needs to be woven into the DNA of schools, such as in the areas listed here. You know, we're so good at looking at education through an academic lens. Now we need to look at it through a prosocial lens. And we're not the only ones advocating for this. This is what CASEL is doing, trying to integrate SEL into all areas of the school. And those 11 principles of character education that I mentioned earlier also really advocates for weaving character into all areas of school. And this is what we're going to be covering at the Institute, is how to do this. So then how do these three areas fit together to form what we call prosocial human development? How do they actually work together? We thought a Venn diagram might illustrate this best. So to start, character education gives the framework of what it means to be a good person. But in order to display good character, you need the social and emotional skills to do so. You need to know how to resolve conflicts. You need the emotional skills to learn to get along with others, that sort of thing. However, sometimes it can be hard in a challenging moment for students, for any of us, to use those SEL skills. And this is where mindfulness comes in. So for example, mindfulness can help us become aware of the signals our body is giving us to tell us that something is not right. They can help us to pause before reacting, which will allow us to use our SEL skills and thus uphold our moral identity. So I hope that explains how these three areas can work together. So just to give you some examples of what this looks like in action, I've put together 4 scenarios. So in this first one, here's a student, Mia. She is working on a group project, and she notices that a friend of hers is cheating by copying the work of another group, which could ultimately affect the outcome for the whole group. So the practice of mindfulness helps her to notice that her fists are clenching and her heart is pounding. But rather than lash out, she pauses, takes a deep breath, and she uses her conflict resolution skills to talk to her friend. She believes in doing the right thing, but she realizes that this is sometimes harder than it sounds. However, by doing it, she learns the value of standing up and also what it means to be a good friend. So in the second example, in a lesson on ratios and healthcare costs, Daryl's math teacher engages the students in a discussion about whether the government is responsible for providing healthcare for its citizens. For Daryl, he's learned mindfulness and contemplative practice in a way that allows him to bring his whole self into the classroom. We'll talk more about what this means at the Summer Institute. This has helped him to recognize deeply entrenched social injustices. He then uses his SEL skills, such as active listening, to engage in respectful and honest dialogue with his classmates. He also is developing his ability to consider ethical dilemmas. So moving on to adults, here's an example of John, who's a new first grade white teacher who is struggling with the demands of teaching, along with understanding his culturally and economically diverse, quote unquote, squirrely students, or at least what he perceives as squirrely. So mindfulness has taught him to take a deep breath to center himself before he responds to a student who, in his mind, has once again not followed instructions. SEL, though, has taught him to wonder whether he is making assumptions about his students, and this student in particular, and then he needs to question those assumptions. And then motivating him to practice SEL and mindfulness as an educator is his desire to be a warm but demanding teacher who's dedicated to social justice. And then in our final example, Amira has just become the principal of a high school. She's inheriting some bitter rivalries among a few teachers. So her practice of mindfulness helps her to realize that the angry emotions of her staff members are not hers. And then through SEL, she uses opening and closing rituals at staff meetings to build trust among her staff, making it safe for them to express ideas, take risks, and voice concerns. However, she realizes through her study of moral ideologies that much of her staff rivalry may come from their different outlooks on life and on education. So I know with these examples, it sounds like an awful lot, but what happens is after a while, these kinds of skills and way of looking at situations in schools, it becomes automatic. I love the example I heard once from a principal who had instituted the Random Acts of Kindness curriculum in his elementary school. And he said after 2 years, they threw the curriculum out because they knew how to do it. They had integrated it into who they were as people, and they knew how to carry this out with students in schools as well. So again, after a while, this just becomes automatic. So I'd like to end this webinar where we began, considering moral traditions around the world, only this time in the spirit of unity by bringing together the East and the West. So John Dewey, the well-known education philosopher and reformer, wrote once, "The ground of democratic ideas and practices is faith in the potentialities of individuals, faith in the capacity for positive developments if proper conditions are provided." And then his contemporary in India, Rabindranath Tagore, a Nobel Prize-winning poet and founder of the famous Shanti Niketan school, whose ideas about education are continuing to influence Indian education to this day, wrote, "In short, the aim of our education is that students should, in the fullest sense, be true to their humanity, and in their thoughts, feelings, and behavior, express this truth." So, with these beautiful ideas on the purpose and potential of education, we have come to the end of our webinar series. I cannot thank you enough for listening or reading, if you did indeed read them. We hope they gave you a good grounding in all three fields, and we look very, very forward to taking this work even deeper with you at the Institute. So take care, and we'll see you soon.